Hi everyone. Today we're talking about just a decade in data engineering, kind of just the lessons I've picked up over the last few years, and some realities I think that I'd like to cover. Just a little bit about me. So a lot of people, you may know me, you may not know me. My name is Rogojan. Online, you often see me as the Seattle data guy. For the longest time, I used to say I was an accidental YouTuber and writer. I think at this point it is intentional, so you'll often find me either on YouTube or Substack, etc. But in my actual day-to-day job for the last few years, I've been consulting and helping companies set up their data infrastructure. Meaning, so I've got to do several greenfield projects, it feels like endless, kind of from the ground up build outs of data infrastructure, as well as doing my fair share of untangling and trying to figure out what the right data infrastructure is for other companies. So it's been a really fun past 3 years, kind of just doing that and being out on my own. Also, I like to cover the fact that I don't live in Seattle anymore, just because sometimes, my name obviously would denote the fact that I live here. I do not. I now live in Denver, so just so no one feels fooled if you're ever talking about me and you think I'm in Pacific time and in Mountain time. All right, so why this talk? Why a decade in data engineering? One, I think it's appropriate because Airflow and I actually have a very similar kind of birth date in terms of like when we came into the data world. I started somewhere in June or July in 2015. And I think Airflow was open source around June 2015 as well. So it just feels appropriate. Also because just so much has happened in this last decade. It feels like it's been a very, very busy decade. We've seen lots and lots of different tools and technologies and methods and approaches. And I like to say that the reality is that most companies are in various different decades of data infrastructure, right? In one company I work with, they're using SQL Server and SSIS and that type of tooling, and others they're on Teradata, and still others are obviously still working on Hadoop. And we really have like multiple ways that people are figuring out how to answer their business problems via data. And I think that's just interesting. I'll literally be in the same company in some cases, and one team is, again, using maybe something that we feel is more modern, and other tools that feel a little older. So sometimes I just find that always fascinating as I'm trying to solve problems and seeing all the various challenges people face because of the tooling choices that they either have or need to migrate away from. All right, so just thinking back to a decade ago, one thing that I very much remember, and in case you can't see the corner of what this is just Google Trends showing what, like basically if you were to look up Hadoop, it also basically was at its zenith or its peak in 2015. So that was when I came into the data world, and that was when I was like, well, everything is going to be data lakes. Every project was a data lake. The company I was working at, that was their big thing. Like, we got to build a data lake because this is what everyone's doing. And as someone who just started in that time as well, I remember hearing the term schema on read, which maybe some people might not have heard that up until this point, but I remember that was the term everyone talked about at that point. It was like, yeah, we're just going to write and basically data modeling and writing queries on read, so when we actually run the query versus like all this complex data modeling. That was kind of the hope that we all were sold back then by various companies. And now Hadoop still definitely exists, but I don't see it as often, and it's crazy to think that I put so much effort into that kind of data stack, and then it's kind of gone. It's just crazy to think that was just a decade ago. But in order to kind of think about like where, like a little bit farther back, I'm just going to take a small peek. I like thinking about what happened before Hadoop and why we even kind of all ran towards it. And one very big thing that sticks out is that prior to that, a lot of these projects were very expensive. A lot of like data infrastructure projects, any sort of data analytics projects, were very expensive for multiple reasons. One, it would be very time consuming. You had to get both hardware and software. Often you had to actually go through procurement. And if anyone's gone through procurement, whether if you're a consultant or just selling to a company, that in itself can take several months, if not in some cases years, just to get something through. And so these projects would be very long. By the time you probably got your server, it probably was too small for whatever data you did end up having. You would have these EDW projects or enterprise data warehouse warehouse projects that would last for years. And then by the time, again, you finally set up, you'd be limited on storage. And that's where a lot of the ways we've done data modeling has also kind of come into play, where we're trying to deal with some of those limitations. To add to that, in many cases, data teams were just part of IT, and sometimes not necessarily a data team. Maybe you had some DBAs who kind of, their job was to manage the databases that you had. Maybe you had the two people that kind of liked doing data work that would build some sort of dashboards. But it was very much controlled by IT. And I think now, somewhere in that space of 2015 to 2020 was when we first started seeing them kind of separate. The other thing I like to bring up is the data work was very heavily centralized. I remember at the very first company I worked at, I was just trying to build some dashboards because that's what my team had asked for. And after a few weeks or a month or so, after them being kind of out in the wild, I had the IT team came to me and they were very frustrated because they're like, no, this is the work that we do. We don't want you building these things. We need to be the ones that manage this. So it's like a very centralized approach back then, and obviously still now at certain companies. I like to say that's when I figured out that I was a shadow data team, because I was just the only data person on a finance team, and so they were just asking me to do everything. So I was like, okay, yeah, I'll do that. But that's kind of like, again, before Hadoop, and then we had Hadoop. And the one final point I wanted to put here that I had a good conversation with someone that at the time, when or at least now they're currently a CEO, but at the time they were doing kind of some CTO work and running a lot of these projects. And I met with them in Denver. One of the points they brought up was, kind of back then, you really kind of felt like you were risking your job when you were taking on some of these projects. Because if you were like a leader on the data team or the IT team, you would be you'd be likely spending $5 or $10 million just to get these projects started. Again, whether that was for Teradata or for Oracle, it would take a long time to actually get to the end states. And then once it was finally set up, hopefully it was at the right scale. Hopefully, you hadn't grown 10, 100 times in your data set size or your overall data that you're trying to manage, and you can actually answer all the business problems. So you felt like you were kind of risking your job, because if you didn't have that all set up, at the end of the day, you might be kind of risking where things were going. All right, and now if you will kind of allow me one final indulgence before I kind of go where things are, and just thinking about back in my day, when I, again, started, the first things I ended up working on were things like SQL Server. The example I always tell when people ask me, like, how'd you start consulting? I tell people the very first project I did, and this is the very first project I did as a consultant, was helping someone move from Access to SQL Server, because they were trying to process a few gigabytes of data, and Access was no longer performing. And so that was the very first project I got to do. Also, the very first ETL tool I got used to or got introduced to was essentially SSIS. So at least for functional purposes, that's how it was used, was essentially our data pipeline. And there was a lot of also just homegrown tools. I remember one company I worked at, they built their entire basically pipeline system out of PowerShell and stored procedures, and then I had to do a ton of work basically writing all the framework around it. So how are we going to track dependencies? How are we going to actually schedule these jobs? I would have to create a metadata table to say, hey, what job has run on what day, so we don't run either duplicates of that job or run one job before the other. So I had to create a whole meta kind of database just for that. I like to tell most people, if you try to rebuild or try to build your own data pipelining or orchestration tool from scratch, you'll probably end up with something that looks very similar to Airflow almost every time, because there's just the functional components that you need, whether that's some sort of metadatabase to track what's run, a scheduler, and some of those other components. And then a lot of access and SSRS in terms of reporting. But that was then. But somewhere in 2018, 2017, I basically found Airflow, and I think this is why many of us kind of clung to it. Again, a lot of us were probably having to build these data pipelines from scratch. We were having to write all this extra code just around our pipelines to make it function. Just, again, logging, something to track what's actually run, what hasn't run. And so I think when it came out in 2015, a lot of us were like, this is nice. It does a lot of the things that I want. And so that's why we kind of stuck with it. And I think what's kind of happened over the last few years is many of us, like myself, have started to put out content about it. It's started to grow in popularity. And now it's often, I find, the default for many people, where they've started with Airflow, which I find fascinating when I talk to people and they're like, oh, that was the first tool I got to work with was Airflow. And I think it's kind of this interesting progression where, again, people adopted it from probably when we started, or when I started. We adopted it because it met and fixed a lot of problems we were dealing with, and then it's kind of still there now because it's kind of this default tool that we all kind of have come to really enjoy. All right, that's not all that's really changed. I realize I need to make one of these more for just the data world in a future article. But a lot of other things have, I think, changed in the data space. Obviously, especially in 2020, that was really, it feels like the rise of these like pay-as-you-go data solutions, right? Those kind of unbundled solutions where a lot of things you could get were piecemeal. So now, instead of you having to pay one or two more expensive engineers, if you're a small company, to like build a lot of the stuff that was custom and taking a long time, you could. Or the other option is you could go and pay for a very expensive contract with one of the bigger vendors. You can now pay as you go, whether that's using something like Snowflake or BigQuery for your data warehouse, whether that's picking out some sort of tool to do your data connectors. You can now move a lot faster. So what I found is that kind of broadened the range of companies that can actually do data analytics, right? You don't have to be a big company. You don't have to be able to afford to hire a full team. You can now, have one or two people do a lot in terms of setting up your data infrastructure. And I think that's where a lot of the consulting work I had gotten, especially early on, was kind of in that space. The other thing that I like to say is that storage kind of became quote unquote infinite. Obviously, it depends on what companies here today. If you're one of the larger tech organizations, you know that that's not true. You're having to build out more literal data infrastructure every day for yourselves because you will literally run out of space. That was something at Facebook. We were always building more and more just server sites because we were running out of space. But for a lot of companies, you probably have a lot more storage that you can kind of use forever. And a lot of that's changed the way we actually operate. Like, you don't have to necessarily use slowly changing dimensions. If you're doing data modeling, you can do, a lot of companies I've seen do like date partitions where they just stick it all on top of each other because storage is much cheaper. So that's changed the way we can even approach data modeling. We also have more compute, so you can run jobs more frequently. I was always running out of actual process space when I was running things on a SQL Server. You'd have to make sure everything ran at the right time. So we've solved a lot of these problems, and what that's also let us do is kind of approach things in a new way. And the thing I really liked about this picture at the very end, there's a little note there that says, kind of today's modern practices. And it feels like a lot of these modern practices that we have, a lot of best practices that we've had, have really kind of been this amalgamation of the last few decades where we're just now trying to figure out, okay, what actually makes sense going forward? Like what makes sense when we add in all these new layers, when we add in the cloud, when we add in new tooling, how can we best set up our data infrastructure for whatever company size we are to make sure that we actually succeed? And then we throw in AI, and now that's just another thing that we're all trying to deal with and figure out, okay, so how does that change, the way that we're doing things? We just got to the cloud. In a lot of cases, many companies are only finally adopting the cloud, and now we're trying to think, okay, do we have to model data differently for AI? Do we have to, do we need to do as much data modeling? And I think this is where a lot of the challenges I've seen companies kind of face, or at least the data world kind of face in terms of what we're trying to do often come from. Because we're sitting here staring at this thing in the face and being like, hey, what does this change fundamentally in terms of how we operate in our day-to-day? But I wanted to take a quick moment and say what I feel has not changed. I've had to consult with companies that range in sizes. I've worked with companies that at this point are AI from the get-go. That's what they do. That's what they offer. And yet the problems on their data infrastructure side and data team side that haven't changed are the ones that I've got here. And there's probably more, but these are the ones that always stick out. The first one is just making data sets accessible. making them accessible is still a crucial aspect. So when I think about the functionality of a data warehouse or a data lakehouse or whatever you want to call it, it often is just about centralizing and getting all the data from all these different sources into a single place, standardizing it, and making it accessible for some end user. In the past, it was clear the end user was a person, and now obviously we have to add in the fact that it's like, well, will a machine be accessing this information? Will it be, is using these data models and having a person on the other end, but they're using an AI? Do we still have to model things in the same way? So that is maybe one part that's changing, but still, we still need to somehow make things accessible for whether it is a machine or a human. Actually, dashboards are still slow. I'm still working on projects where, they take a long time to run. They take, minutes to run, and I find that interesting. So I always think back to my professor in my database course who told me that that's what they did for consulting, is they would go to companies and improve query performance. They would just add an index in those cases, and suddenly the query performance would be improved. But yeah, I'm surprised to always find that dashboards in many companies are still slow. And so that often comes back to either data modeling or figuring out, how to make sure you preset up things. At this moment, I'd say batch is still king. So in terms of like stream versus batch, I still run into most cases where, one, most people are building batch, and two, most people don't need more than that because generally we're still limited by a human on the other end. In many cases, whatever that pipeline's going, there's a human making a decision on the end, and as long as you have that, right, we can only make those decisions so fast. We maybe only have so many things in terms of human processes that can happen. That is one place that I imagine the more we get confident with AI systems could change, because those, an AI could make things, make decisions immediately versus having to wait and have some sort of meeting or whatever it might be that goes through and looking at a dashboard, et cetera, when you're building those products. And finally, aligning with the business and actually delivering things that they want remains really, really hard. It feels like I keep coming to companies where I'll look at what they have. I'll talk to the business. Maybe they have 100 dashboards, and despite having 100 dashboards, either no one's making a decision off of data, or they tell me, well, I can't actually find the information that I need. So there's still this kind of gap that remains even, I think, to this day. And so I think that's still a very hard place that we're trying to constantly fill the gap, and that I continue to see. All right, and then just a few quick lessons that I've learned. And obviously there's probably dozens of lessons that have to do with everything from how to make sure I'm actually keeping code clean and things of that nature. But in terms of trying to pick the right tooling or things of that nature, I like to say, start with functionality before tooling. Like, be very clear in terms of like what you're trying to solve. What is the problem? That even when you're thinking of like data warehouses, like what are you trying to do? And I think the big functionality, like I referenced earlier, is like we want to centralize data, make it accessible for some sort of end user. That end user, we're hoping maybe they want to have sales data and marketing data to make better ad spend decisions or whatever it might be on the other side. But being very clear about that before going down the route of picking tooling, because once you go down the route of tooling, vendors are great at selling you that their product is the choice. And if you don't have a clear set of functionality, you'll probably just pick whatever tool you think sounded the best if you don't have a clear way of knowing which one fits yours best. I also like to say where the data work stops is often where the business value begins. Whatever data product you're delivering, whether it's a dashboard, whether it's a machine learning model, or something else, just delivering it and throwing it over the fence is not sufficient. Generally, I found that in most cases, I've had to do some work afterwards, right? Like I have to make sure, in one example, I was recently working on some fraud detection systems. I talked to the teams who would actually be implementing this and actually looking over the results and in terms of like how are they going to adopt it? What is their day-to-day with it going to be, right? And after that, even after delivering it, making sure I follow up with them, understand if there are problems. You can't just drop it off and say, hey, change should happen now that I've delivered it. You do have to kind of do something more besides just delivering the data product. And I like to say that data teams that win have to be outcome obsessed. That is to say, again, kind of like that second point, you have to really care about where things are going. You can't just drop it off and say, hey, we're good, we're done. That's all we expected. You have to be very much obsessed with the other side and how the business is going to be using it. Awesome. Well, I want to say, first of all, thank you. Thank you, everyone.